Welcome everybody to our May 2024 members meeting. This is, I guess this is the fourth year that we have revitalized our members meeting thanks to the wonderful Deidre Lynch, who launched us 4 years ago by having a public facing event at our members meeting. We're really excited to also have with us today Lita Judge, who is our inaugural winner of our new award, the Arts and Public Engagement Award, which Lissette will talk about in a little bit. But this was a way for us to highlight and honor people in our community, or that we would like to see in our community, who are doing work with our authors that involves art and engagement with the public. So we're really excited to have Lita here, and we're going to hear about her work with Mary Shelley. Before we begin the talk and the more fun part of the meeting, since this is our members meeting, we do have a few things to tell you about and to update you on. And if you aren't current members, we would love it if you became members to be part of our community and to get all of our emails and be part of our events. And you can go to our website to do that. So the first official business I must transact is to ask for approval for the May 2023 members meeting minutes, which are in a folder which I'll copy into the chat here. If you'd like to look at our reports and get a really granular sense of what you're up to, of what we're up to, we'll give you a kind of shorthand series of reports in the next 10 minutes, but there's all the documents if you want to read them. But so I need to call for a vote, or I would like to motion for approval for the May 2023 members meeting minutes, if I could have a second. Okay, and thank you, Neil and Olivia, all in favor? Okay, wonderful. I think they're approved. I guess I'm supposed to say any nays. I learned this year in my other role at Mount Holyoke. Okay, so I already directed you to our reports. There, I'll just give you a few highlights. You'll find news on the Keats-Shelley journal, and we should have a new journal issue coming out this summer. We also have digital content that comes from the journal on our website, which I would encourage you all to look at. Casey Wills has been working tirelessly to highlight and translate some of that content. We also have, we've just put up the information for our 2024 Curran Symposium, which will be called Performing Politics and is in honor of Byron and Byron's last days, however belatedly. But we're really excited to think about the necessary ills of thinking about politics through performance, through drama, and other forms of mediation during what I'm sure will be an interesting election cycle. And that will take place in October, but you can see all the details on our website if you look under events. Olivia is going to tell us about our work in public outreach in a minute. The reports also will talk about upcoming pedagogy panels on Keats and the Shelleys that Omar Miranda has designed at Nassar and the BARS conferences. And there may also be an update about, we have a lot of stuff going on at MLA in January that we're excited about. We also just updated our mission and values statements this year, so we'd love you all to check them out. And there's lots of other information. But again, Olivia will be highlighting some of the things we do for public outreach, since this is our members meeting. Before we say more, though, I just wanted to take a minute to highlight that I know that, or really to acknowledge that this has been a really difficult political, social time for many of us, not only since October, but also since, in the response to what happened in October, and the subsequent famine and death within Gaza, and of course, the protests and encampments that have sprung up all over the country at many of our campuses. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that this has been a really difficult time for many of us. And I just wanted to hold a moment for that, that difficulty and that pain, even that's happening even as we attend this event. In part because we want to hold space for that, but also because I think for many of us, we still believe that romantic belief that our work in literature and art might do something in some way to help. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge the difficulties that we are living in. But I think I'm very glad that we can all be together. And I think without further ado, there's one more piece of business I need to do. We often vote on our new board members this year at the members meeting. We're so grateful. We had so many nominations from so many of you that we actually couldn't get through our nominations process this year in adequate time to give you a slate. So in a second, I'm going to move that we postpone our voting, and we have for the past, well, really since COVID, we've done our voting by proxy. So all this to say, in the first part of June, you will receive a ballot by email, and we'll ask you all to vote by proxy on our new nominations. Once we have them, we will be electing 2 or 3 new board members, which will, I'm sure, be excited to share with you. So just to let you know that that's all happening. And I guess I officially have to move that we postpone the vote on the nominations for new board members until June. So if someone could second that, I would be very grateful. Thank you, Olivia. All in favor? Thank you. If there are any nays, please nay me. Okay, and I think that's passed. So please look forward. Actually, in the next few weeks, there will be emails for anyone who would like to nominate distinguished scholars for our Distinguished Scholar Awards. And then there will also be a few weeks later an email sending around nominations and asking for a proxy vote for our new board members. All right, so that officially includes the business that I must attend to in this members meeting, and I'm going to hand it off now to Olivia Moy, our vice president, who is in charge of our public outreach committee, to give us an update on all of the amazing work they've been doing.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Moy. I'm one of the vice presidents of K-SAA, and I had the good fortune of collaborating with a new working group this year to spearhead our first ever public outreach initiative. We had selected the theme of commonplacing and commonplace books as a way to bring students and the general public together to commune with 18th and 19th century texts and approach them afresh in an intimate, often tactile way. Historical commonplacing challenges typical ideas of romantic authorship, canonicity, and the formation of literary taste. Over the course of this year, we learned a great deal about the needs of students and teachers working with 19th century texts, about the value of mixed media and artistic composition to literary studies, about romantic reading and writing in relationship to the digital world. But most of all, it brought together a community of thinkers and scholars brainstorming new ways to access and experience romantic writing for young people in the 21st century. So we're very thankful to Catherine Bergevin, who helped us build this beautiful website that really serves as a hub for our project. It links to primary and secondary sources, including scholarship by people like Deidre Lynch, Mylin Chang, Gillian Hess, others, and we're continually building that. So if you would like to help us Please do send in more recommendations so we can keep building that out. Our K-SAA Communications Fellow, Shelley Audsley, who's based in the UK, created an impressive digital commonplace book that invites readers from around the world to share their notes and annotations on romantic works. She coded, digested, and organized them in the form of this beautifully interactive star chart, which you can go check out online, where others can zoom in and out to see what people around the world are reading and what themes and ideas emerge and overlap. We even worked with the Keats-Shelley House in Rome to post a QR code at the museum's physical space so that visitors could also log in and contribute a digital entry to volume 2 of Shelley's Global Digital Commonplace book, and the focus of that one is literary tourism. Casey Wills, who is our K-SAA Comms Fellow, who works on the Keats-Shelley Journal, organized interviews and with artists and writers who engage with commonplacing. Most recently, she spoke with Ellen Gruber-Garvey, whose wonderful book, Writing with Scissors, shows that collecting and curating scraps of news was a way for often marginalized individuals to write alternative histories of the US. So that interview just came out 2 weekends ago in honor of National Scrapbook Day, and you can read that in full on our blog. We also interviewed Candace Hicks, an artist who has sewn nearly 20 books by hand, writing not with pencil and paper, but with needle and thread. The content of these books are extemporized as the rhythm of her fingers follow her thoughts, and we see the truly tactile materialization of putting thoughts down on paper and weaving stories together. Students were able to hold and touch Candace Hicks's book objects when they visited the Fales collection at NYU on one of several excursions focusing on commonplace books. Indeed, this past year, 50 students from the City University of New York paid visits to the Morgan Library and Museum, the NYU Fales collection, and the NYPL's Fortzheimer collection of Shelley and his Circle to see firsthand historical commonplace books that are now housed in New York City special collections. Some highlights of the trips included Henry David Thoreau's commonplace book at the Morgan, Sir Isaac Newton's pocket memorandum book from the 1600s, full of astronomical calculations, beautifully illustrated annuals and friendship albums from the 19th century, and also a personal favorite, Beehive Valentine, that could only be discovered when lifted gingerly by the reader. These encounters with historical commonplace books brought so much joy to the visiting students, and we heartily thank the librarians and curators who hosted them. Those were Philip Palmer at the Morgan, Charlotte Priddle at NYU, and our very own K-SAA board member, Liz Denlinger, at the Fortzheimer collection of Shelley and his Circle. Some students opted to create their own commonplace books digitally, while others returned to the good old-fashioned codex. So there are a few images here, just examples of what the students produced. We've identified about a dozen teachers who have been working with commonplacing this year. And by modest count, we counted about 300 students who made commonplace books this past year alone, which is really exciting. So the faculty listed here on the sides, they represent tenured professors and non-tenured lecturers from public and private colleges who serve STEM and agricultural institutions, community colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and multilingual first-year composition classrooms. A lot of them have offered to write up their pedagogical reflections as articles that will be published in a forthcoming special issue of KSJ Plus. So please stay tuned for that. I think our big interest would be to expand even more to high school classrooms, which we've worked. Matt Park is here from Bard Early College, so we're very excited about that. Students also used their commonplace books as a space to annotate, analyze, and practice a single romantic poem to recite and record on the online platform recitedverse.com, which was created by Omar Miranda with help by Danny Snelson, and they introduced this to us. We had 80 students upload recordings onto the site, reciting poems by romantic women writers in particular, including Charlotte Smith, Felicia Hemans, Phyllis Wheatley, Anna Letitia Barbold, and Dorothy Wordsworth. The students said that embodying the voices of writers gave them an appreciation for language that they previously found foreign and distant. So we hope to expand classroom use of recited verse in 2025 And we invite all of you members to add your voices as well. Anyone can quickly log in and record a favorite poem. We were delighted to learn that organizers of the British Women Writers Conference, which is taking place next month in Boulder, Colorado, will be creating a conference-wide digital commonplace book to which all attendees can contribute papers, postcards, images, or parts of archival documents. So we can't wait to see the progress of this ambitious project, and we'll link it on to the KSJ Plus site as well. Please stay tuned for our forthcoming issue of the Keats-Shelley Journal Plus, edited by Casey Wills. That is the online arm of the KSJ print journal. After the summer, you'll be able to read and see more in-depth accounts of some of the great artistic work by students and the pedagogical work by teachers. We invite all of our K-SAA members, old and new, to join us as we continue this journey and plan ahead for our next outreach initiative in the coming year. So thanks so much. I'm going to turn things over now to Bryonie Carter and Lissette Lopez Szwydky to talk about our A&PE Award. And I'd like to thank our whole working group that collaborated to really come up with this and make it happen.
Thanks, Olivia. And yeah, it's been a really exciting year for all of these great initiatives, and it's been so fun to be a part of it. Hi, everyone. I'm Bryonie Carter. I'm a member of the board of directors and a co-chair of our new Arts and Public Engagement Award, which Lissette will introduce formally in just a second. Before that, I just wanted to let everyone know that by registering and attending this meeting, you are automatically entered in a raffle to win one of 2 copies of Lita Judge's Mary's Monster. And Lita Judge is, of course, our featured presenter today. And so I have a program. It's going to draw 2 names randomly, and hopefully we will have some good news for 2 of you at the end of our meeting. So Lissette, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryonie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Lissette Lopez Szwydky. I'm also a member of the board of directors and part of the committee for the Arts and Public Engagement Award, which is new to the K-SAA, and I'm very excited to talk about it a little bit and then to introduce our inaugural recipient. The Arts and Public Engagement Award came together as really a way to acknowledge that so much engagement with Romantic period writers and topics happens outside of the traditional spaces where many of us who are members of the K-SAA would operate, which would be in scholarship and in the college level classroom. So the Arts and Public Engagement Award is has been created for us to acknowledge, celebrate people who are engaging substantially with Romantic period texts or authors in a number of different formats that reach a wide audience beyond the academy. So that's the major kind of criterion for this award. I am very excited to introduce our inaugural award recipient, Lita Judge, and I have a formal introduction, but also I'm going to try to contain my excitement because for those of you who have not engaged or have not yet gotten a chance to read Mary's Monster, it is an absolutely breathtakingly beautiful work that I think defies genre, and that might be a question or some questions to talk about during the Q&A, because it's definitely part biography, art. It's visual art. Some people called it a graphic novel in verse. There's just so many ways to talk about it, but I will contain my excitement just a little bit so that you can get some official details about Lita Judge and her work. Lita Judge is the author and illustrator of 30 fiction and nonfiction books, including Mary's Monster, Love, Madness, and How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein, published in 2018 by Macmillan Press. Another one of her books, Flight School, has been recently adapted into an off-Broadway musical. Awards for her many books include the International Reading Association Children's Book Award, an ALA Notable an NCTE Notable Book, a Kirkus Best Book, and the Jane Addams Honor. Mary's Monster, the extensive project for which she is being honored today, has won several awards, including the 2019 NCSS CBC Award for Notable Social Studies Trade Book, making it a book that can be taught in social studies classes in addition to, or ideally in collaboration with, English language arts classes. Mary's Monster is also a 2019 Amelia Bloomer Project Book, which is an annual annotated book list of well-written and well-illustrated books with significant feminist content intended for young readers. There's also a teacher's guide that has been published for the book, and I will share links to some resources during the Q&A following the presentation. Lita's career in many ways embodies a romantic sensibility shared by many of the writers we study and teach. Before she created art and books, Lita was a geologist and worked on dinosaur digs. But a trip to Venice, Italy inspired her to quit her job and pursue a lifelong passion for creating art, something which I think most of us would love to instill in our students, or at least do for ourselves. So thank you for modeling that, Lita. Now, when not in her studio, she can be found backpacking through Europe with a sketchbook and easel in hand, painting the streets of Italy, France, Sweden, Russia, and many other places that have inspired many of her books. Her book, Mary's Monster, was inspired through reading Mary Shelley's journals while exploring places she had traveled. This book created a rich opportunity to explore working in a completely new form, combining free verse with full-page illustrations in novel form. Lita was drawn to capturing the interior world of Mary Shelley's mind, as well as the realistic images of her life. Mary's Monster is a unique book that visually captures core concepts of the romantic sublime as it guides its readers through an original biography in verse, accompanied by more than 150 monochrome watercolor spreads. So the book is absolutely visually breathtaking. The 300-page illustrated biography in verse is the culmination of I think 6 years of reading, research, and recreating the biography of Mary Shelley and following the legacy of Frankenstein. Through Judge's artistic vision, the Shelleys and their circles come to life for contemporary readers, especially younger readers. In addition to being an enjoyable and innovative book, as a historical period study told through its most famous, well-connected literary woman, the illustrated book is an excellent way to introduce students from junior high through college to general readers of the major historical events, themes, and literary figures of the early 19th century. In my opinion, Judge expertly recasts Mary Shelley as the heroine of her own Gothic YA story, and that's something that I know my students have really resonated with. I've taught this book at least once per year since it came out in 2018 to undergraduates, graduate students, and as well as K through 12 educators that I've worked with through a professional development program. And every single one of them has just turned away and said, this is the book. This is the book that I needed to introduce all of the characters, AKA the literary circle of the Shelleys and all of the people they were engaged with during the period. Personally, the way I use this book in my classes is to introduce students to the context, the historical and biographical context preceding the novel, and it gets them absolutely hooked. And it just increases their engagement across the board in terms of wanting to research and learn more and their own creative processes. Last semester, I had a student whose final project was a Frankenstein series of poems, and she introduced illustrations. And she said 100%, this is a poet graduating with an MFA. She said, I had never thought to illustrate my poetry, and Lita Judge's book inspired me to do so, and the results were fabulous. So please, everyone, start finding ways to incorporate this book into your classes. Your students will thank you. So the book's framing concepts provide a contemporary counterpart to the frame story in Mary Shelley's novel, which is really cool from a literary standpoint, and it invites broader discussions about literature, its historical legacies, and its continued importance. I will turn the screen and mic over now to Lita Judge so that we can all learn more about the process behind creating this innovative, engaging, and quite frankly, breathtakingly beautiful project. That is how I'm going to leave it. Please join me in welcoming Lita Judge as the recipient for the inaugural K-SAA Arts and Public Engagement Award. Thank you for being with us today, Lita.
Thank you. It's such a deep honor to receive this award. I really appreciate being here with you all because I know you share the passion for this literature, Mary Shelley, and all the literature of the period. But when I heard about the award and how you framed the premise of arts and public engagement, it really meant a lot to me because that's the whole reason I wrote this book, was to try to bring the world of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein to a younger audience in a way that I wish it had been brought to me when I was a youngster. So it means a lot to me to have to have people recognize that that's what I had set out to do with this book. I have slides of my process in creating it in the book. So I'm going to do a screen share, and hopefully I can do this fairly seamlessly. Where do I hit play?
It's playing already.
Oh, it's playing already. Okay. So does everybody see the slideshow? Can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, great. So this is just a selection of the books I've written, and you can see most of my books are written for a much younger audience. I love writing for a younger audience because I'm a very visual creator. Picture books is a place that I really landed as a creator because it's a format that's very visual, first of all, and second of all, my background as a youngster, I was very I was dyslexic, and also I was raised in a very remote part of the country. I was born in Alaska on a little island. I spent several years living in a car in very remote areas of the country, so I didn't have a lot of access to books. And so when I entered school at an older age, a conventional school, I struggled to embrace reading, but I had a love affair with story from an early age. First, imagining stories as a form of keeping myself company as a youngster living in a very remote area, but also just feeding the desire to create. And so I really landed with writing books for very young children because as an artist and a writer, I feel like the gift that I get to do is to create books that invite really young readers who are either pre-literate or just learning literacy to engage in a text in a way that helped me to engage in text because I was so connected to visual material. And the earliest books I had access to were bird guide books because my grandparents were ornithologists, my parents were naturalists. And I really learned how to read by going through bird books and seeing the pictures and then embracing with the text. So Mary Shelley was definitely a departure for me. And the reason I wrote this book was because I had read Frankenstein in high school, and the text resonated with me, but not in a visceral way. I struggled to understand it fully, and I realized in hindsight, I just don't think I had enough life experiences to fully understand the story, particularly because I didn't understand the historical backdrop leading into the story, and I didn't understand the creator behind it. Years later, when I had written and illustrated, I read the text again in a very different circumstance, because not only was I was an adult and I had spent a lifetime writing, but I was experiencing a long-term illness, and I was pretty much confined to a bed for a year. And so I was experiencing a kind of isolation because it's very hard to engage with friends. And I had been touring and doing a lot of book tours and going to schools, and suddenly I was really confined to my room. And I was going through book after book reading, and I stumbled onto Frankenstein again, and the book was just seared right through me, my connection to the material, because the book is Frankenstein is all about isolation. And So I wanted to understand the author behind this story. I just quickly Googled, I knew nothing about Mary Shelley, and I discovered that she was 19 when she wrote the book, and that just shocked me because she was a teenager, and I thought, how does a teenager understand these concepts well enough to write a book with this kind of impact? Then with a little further research, I realized that she was an unwed pregnant girl who ran away from home when she wrote this book. And that just completely shocked me because that's something I had never heard of. When I read the book as a teenager, if I had known that, I think I would have experienced the book in a much different way. And I was almost angry that I had been deprived understanding the girl behind the book, that I was taught the book in school, but none of the backstory of the author was given. And I felt like it would have changed my relationship to the text if I had known that. And so I became obsessed with Mary Shelley. I read everything I could find about her, every biography. I read every biography about the people who around her, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Coleridge. I read about the science of the time because she had grown up really engaged with the science of her time. You know, the historical conflicts of the French Revolution and her mother witnessing the revolution and being kind of the first feminist to write about the rights of women. And that once I dived into that, I realized I had to write this book. I even went to the Bodleian Library and saw the original texts of her manuscripts and her letters and diaries. And this is something you can find online, but whenever I'm going to write a book, I really do a kind of a full immersion because it creates a sense of ownership over the material, like, a sense of passion that really ignites and fuels me through the process of creating a book. In this case, this book took 6 years of just solid hard work. And I think seeing her, being able to hold her writing and seeing it in person, it's so much different than just seeing scans digitally. So these trips are really important for me. All of my books start while I'm traveling, while I'm away from the studio. This book was no different. My process is to go to a place that I love. Either I've selected the place, and like in this case, because it's taking me to the place where my subject, where Mary Shelley was living, where she traveled. This is a picture of her mother's grave, made famous for the fact that Mary and Shelley cemented their relationship in this graveyard. But all of my books start this way, where I get on the land and I walk and I witness the beauty. I carry journals with me. These are journals from one trip. Often in a 2-week period, I'll just manically write and paint, probably fill 7 to 10 journals on a trip. I paint and record everything I can possibly see during those trips, because that's the way in which I solidify my ideas and capture the ideas behind a story. I'm also writing moments of Mary Shelley's life. I've done the research and the reading before the trip, and on the trip, I'm not worried about plotting out the book or writing the book. I'm just what's coming to the surface, what is remarkable about her life as I'm walking over the land that she where she lived and following in her footsteps. And this is all an exercise that has helped me go from being a kid who was dyslexic and really struggled with reading and writing to somebody who really embraces telling stories, but finding a way that works for me. And I think the reason I ultimately chose to do this text visually is because one of my huge goals in life is to embrace readers who are like me, who may struggle when they're younger with just writing, but are passionate about the content that they're reading and passionate about stories. And so the journey of finding the process that worked for me, I think, has helped me to create work that hopefully engages readers who may come with that same life experience. The cool thing about when you investigate a story this way and travel is that a lot of the things that you see and do end up showing up directly into the book. Once I get home, it's the time to start writing. And when I say writing, I mean the process of writing for me, which never starts with words. It always starts with visual images. I see my books before I ever hear my books. In the case of Mary, I was flooded with images because I had spent so much time reading about her life, exploring her, where she lived, where she fled to with Shelley across, we traveled from England over France into Switzerland, thinking about her life this whole time. And so for about 6 months, I will go home and just draw and not worry about plot and outline. I just draw her life until it starts gelling and solidifying into an image. I'm also trying to draw her creature. I tried to isolate myself from seeing images of Frankenstein depicted in movies. I wanted to get back to the creature that she had created. Eventually, it's time to start thinking about the words. And this is where the most challenging part of the book came for me, because the obvious choice, if I wanted to do a visual book for young adults, was to write it as a graphic novel. Because when I wrote this book, there really wasn't an example of a visual novel that wasn't a graphic novel for YA. And in publishing, the reality is booksellers want to catalog it or place it on a shelf and be able to label it as a genre. And so I tried to make Mary Shelley fit into the genre of graphic novels. I spent quite a few months plotting out, creating the cells, struggling with the words because something wasn't quite working. I could plot out the moments of her life, but I couldn't find the rhythm of the words to go with that. And I realized the reason I was struggling was because Mary Shelley doesn't fit in a graphic novel form. Her life was so full of visceral passion, loss, betrayal, abandonment, isolation. If I were to fit this on a graphic novel, everything had to be confined into these small little cells with a lot of white negative space surrounding them. And it made her life feel very small. But the reality is she was completely seized by loss and devastation, but also this incredible will to survive and this passion. And so I needed the illustrations to just completely bleed off the page. I needed room to show the reality of her life and also the imagery of her imagination. And that required that these be full bleed illustrations. And the joy of working this way for me, when I allow myself the space to not worry about writing and just see the book first, is that always ends up coming up with the solutions for the writing as well. Because I realized if I formatted the book in full bleed illustrations, then I would have the room to create poems. And poems suddenly clicked for me that was the only way I could tell this book was in verse, because she fell in love with a poet. She was hanging out with the lights of Byron, and poetry was a huge part of her life. And also poems were the only way to capture, there's so much history and backstory that's important in this story, but there's also so much emotional content to her life. And poetry was the only way to really dive into these moments of searing pain and searing loss and searing passion in a way that a graphic novel wouldn't allow me to go into that with such gravity. And so I finally found the form of how I want to tell this book, which is why it is genre bending, because it's more like a picture book, but it's for YA and it's written in verse, and it has the full bleed illustrations. Once I figured out the form and the genre of the book, then I needed to start really focusing on the writing and to hear the voice. And this is where I had the biggest decision to make, because I knew my publisher would be interested in doing a nonfiction biography. Nonfiction biography in YA is something, it's a genre that people appreciate. And I had done all the research to find out, I dived through her letters, her diaries, her manuscripts, and followed. I wanted to honor the truth of this story. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that one of the reasons I wrote this book was because 200 years after its creation, we're still reading this book. It's iconic to our culture. We're so influenced by her creature. This is a young teenage runaway who wrote one of the most read books of all time. And the reason for that is because the creature lives in the minds of everybody. If you ask, when I was creating this book, I would ask people if they knew anything about Mary Shelley, and very few people knew much about Mary Shelley, but everybody knew about Frankenstein. And I thought, ultimately, Frankenstein has to have a voice. So that's is where it's biographical. I dive into her life, but it's also, I had to honor the creature that she created because he really has existed for 200 years. And he's kind of, you know, alive in his own way. So the creature opens the book with the prologue. He speaks, he's the first voice you hear. It says, most people didn't believe Mary Shelley, a teenage girl, unleashed me, a creature powerful and murderous enough to haunt their dreams. They expected girls to be nice and obey the rules. They expected girls to be silent and swallow punishment and pain. She was cast out from society because she loved a married man. Her friends reviled her. Her father banished her from his home. She conceived me. I took shape like an infant, not in her body, but in her heart, growing from her imagination till I was bold enough to climb out of the page and into your mind. Now Mary is the ghost, whose bones have turned to dust, and it is I who lives on. But hear her voice. She wrote my story, and now she will reach beyond the grave and tell you her own. So he starts the prologue, and then we go into the story of Mary Shelley telling the story. Once I've got this all figured out, then it's time for me to just block out the entire story. I had, I think, 8 bulletin boards, 4x8 bulletin boards. I don't work at a computer. And when I'm speaking in schools, I really feel like it's important to share this part of the process, because when we are taught to write, we are always taught to write with words. And I think that it's a great pity because a lot of us don't work that way. And we work, you know, visually. And so I work at bulletin boards. I literally do thousands and thousands of drawings and draw what is happening on each page. And long after that's paced out, then I write the poems that go with the work. And since I've been an author, I've talked to other people that work this way. It's not as common of a way, but one of my passions is to speak to teachers and try to get more people of the mindset that perhaps this would be a way to teach kids who are like me how to write, because this is a process that works really well. The wonderful thing about writing Mary Shelley is how it brings to life the text of Frankenstein, because Frankenstein parallels her life. The novel parallels her own life. The more I learned about Mary, the more I understood the text of Frankenstein, because there were just so many remarkable intersections between the novel and her own life. One of the things that really comes to the surface is just the resounding isolation that she experienced as a young girl. Her mother died giving birth to her, and her father married a woman that had her own children and really didn't get along with Mary. And by the time she was 14, she was cast out of her house. Her father sent her to Scotland to live with a family that she didn't know. And she was sent abroad. She also was experiencing the isolation by the fact that she had lost her mother, and in kind of the most painful way possible, because her mother was this formative woman who was the first person to really write for women's rights, and she was this powerful figure, and yet Mary's birth is the cause of her mother's death, and she was really haunted by that. And it's something that we see reoccurring throughout the book, is this obsession with death. But her mother was also this remarkable guiding post in her life, because particularly when she was in Scotland, she was with a family who knew and respected her mother, had her books. She started reading a lot of her books, and it's as if the words of her mother were being directed to her. And so we see her understanding kind of her roots, you know, what she's made of. We see her really coming into her own. And the more remarkable thing for me as a creator of this book was, here's this young girl who was incredibly isolated and had every reason to not survive. And yet she was a survivor. She was such a passionate, strong young woman. She was brilliant, and she really fought. And I love the period when she was in Scotland, because I think the space, even though she was isolated from her family, I think the space that she had there and the opportunity to stay with a family that respected and admired her mother just really allowed her to get her own strength, to gather her own strength. Eventually, her father did call her back home, and one of the challenges with this book was how much backstory there is to understand Frankenstein. You really have to understand that England has been in the throes of fighting with France for 20 years, that the Napoleonic Wars, there was the French Revolution, and then Napoleon conquered much of Europe. And her father, Godwin, was this remarkable man who really he was the first person to really call himself an anarchist, and he was behind the French Revolution. But unfortunately, by the time Mary is returning to England, Napoleon has been sent off and the king has been reinstated into France, and there's chaos, and her father's been labeled as a radical. He's now in debt. He's kind of vilified from society. So instead of the legacy of her mother, she's being thrown into living with her father again, and he is on the verge of bankruptcy and threatened to go into debtor's prison. They're living really in the slums of Holbein. They're just blocks away from Newgate Prison, which features so predominantly in her novel because of the experiments with electricity that they're performing on prisoners while she is living there. Also, they're surrounded by the slaughterhouses because it's the area of Holborn where a lot of the tanneries were. And so this is a young girl. When I was a teenager and had read the novel, I knew that it was a woman author. And I think a lot of the movies I had seen or things I had heard glimpses of, my vision of her was she was an aristocrat, she was a middle-aged woman. The reality is she was not only a teenager, but she was living a life of poverty in some really tough, a really tough area of Holborn. So I needed to find ways to depict this. She is thrown back into this world, and she's still feeling this isolation because she's back with a stepmother that hates her. She's surrounded with this really tough neighborhood. Her father is really at threat of going to debtor's prison. Until everything changes when Shelley shows up at the door. In search of her father, Godwin. He's a fellow anarchist and young poet. And he sweeps her off her feet and quickly convinces her to run away with him to Geneva, and taking her stepsister Claire with them. This was a fun part of the book to write because there was moments of passion and love, but it also was an amazing part because this is really where Mary grew up and understood the historical consequences of her times. They're walking across France and witnessing all the devastation. And my goal here as a writer was to record the history that she is experiencing, seeing the burnt out villages and the miles of graveyards and the children who are starving because the crops have failed because their soldiers have gone off to fight the wars. But it was also my goal as an author to depict what this was doing in terms of sculpting her as a young woman. She was seeing kids who were deformed from malnutrition and witnessing poverty at a level that was even beyond her own level, and just seeing the ugliness and cruelty of what man can do to his fellow man. And so I needed to create a way to show her imagination. This is where it's not just straight up nonfiction biography, but also showing, the inception of this incredibly brilliant young imagination. So in the book, I chose to have ways to depict the art where you see Mary in life, the painting is not distorted, but where you see her imagination, or if you see a historical connection, like in the case of depicting her mother, you see the art distorted and gritty, and to separate so that the viewer can understand that this is Mary, the girl walking through France, and this is what she's imagining in her mind. And you can tell by reading her diary that she was highly impacted by what she was witnessing. They stayed only briefly in Geneva because Shelley had really no plan, no money. They have to go back to England. But her isolation continues because Shelley is really haunted by his own demons. I think, brought on probably by his own mental instability, but also opiate use. But you can also see the parallels with Frankenstein and the novel in this poet that she's madly in love with, but who is incredibly haunted. And also quite abusive towards her because he is still married and still connected to his wife, but she's now carrying his child and forced into an even more extreme form of isolation because now she's left alone much of the time while he's escaping the bailiffs and avoiding getting into debtor's prison. But she can't even go back to her family. Her father won't let her come through the doorway. He didn't recognize, or he wouldn't acknowledge her when he passed her on the street. He wouldn't let her see her siblings. Her sister, both her stepsister is allowed to go home and visit her mother, but Mary is not allowed to go home and see the sister that she left behind, Fanny. And so she's experiencing this extreme form of isolation. And this is where I had a chance to create a lot of visual themes, just like with the words, there was a lot of themes that paralleled the book. I wanted to create art that showed the isolation. So in the sections where she's talking about this isolation, you see her depicted either behind window grills or in doorways that she's not allowed to go through. This is a scene that depicting when her sister Fanny came to visit her once. She dared to defy the father and came and visited Mary. Mary's heavy with child. She's alone. She's very scared. Her mother died giving birth to her, and now Mary's facing her impending labor. And she sees her sister one last time, and you see her not able to go home. You know, she's standing at the doorway. When Mary finished the book, she talked about looking into the eyes of, it was as if she was staring into the eyes of her prodigy, the creature she had created, so that I depicted her with her creature still, but still behind these grills, because she still was facing the isolation for the fact that society had vilified her for falling in love with a married man. The big core reason I wrote this book was because the one and only fact I knew about Mary Shelley when I read it as a teenager was that the lore was that she wrote this book as a result of a dare by Lord Byron, that they had visited the Villa Diotti in Geneva, and they were all shacked up together in a violent thunderstorm, and he had dared them all to write ghost stories, and therefore Mary runs upstairs and writes Frankenstein. And as a teenager, I believed it, and I didn't think further onto it. But as an adult woman reading this text, I was angered by the fact that that was the only fact I knew, because it was giving credit for this incredible, remarkable book that has survived 200 years and laying it at the feet of a man instead of giving Mary her due course. And as I dived into her life, I realized the lore of the dare was only a catalyst, but Mary Shelley, the inception of this book happened when she gave birth to their first daughter, Claire. Claire was premature, lived for 10 days, and then Mary was holding Claire as Claire passed away. And in her diary, she describes in graphic detail having a dream where she held Claire by the fire until the fire revived her, and then she opened her eyes again. And you realize this is the inception of Frankenstein. This is the moment where she has the idea for this novel. The poem on it is, I am 17 already. I am daughter to ghosts and mother to bones. She's thinking about her mother had died giving birth to her, and now she's given birth to her daughter. It was her hope of having a family, and that daughter has died. And the way she depicts it is straight out of the novel Frankenstein. She doesn't start writing at this point because she's just embroiled in all of this incredible loss and grief. She's not only grieving Claire, but Shelley is still connected to his wife, who has given birth to a son who survives. And also he's almost Shelley having, if not just an emotional relationship, but probably a physical relationship with her stepsister. And so Mary is not writing, she's just embroiled in this loss and grief. But they do regroup and pull themselves together and go back to Geneva, this land where they hope to find utopia and freedom to create and express. And this is where we get to the Villa Diotta. And this was one of my favorite parts of the book, because this is for a brief moment of time, you can really see what the attraction between her and Shelley was. He did completely respect her and admire her and supported her writing. It was an interesting time that when she started writing, he stopped writing. And when I was able to read the manuscripts and their letters, it was wonderful to see how they edited each other's work. She edited his work perhaps even more heavily than he edited her work, partly because he would make little notes in the columns for how to reword things, and she would disregard and keep her wording in some cases. It was as a creator of this book, it was such a wonderful time to dive into this relationship. It was also really a wonderful place in the book to depict the art, because there's so many things that are happening in this villa that turn out in the novel. One of the things I found really fascinating was that the volcano that had erupted and kind of created like a winter situation in that summer, devastating crops, and that creating all the thunder and lightning for the notorious ghost story Dare Night. You really realize how much that was fueling the novel. And so I didn't want to just depict that she's learning about the volcano. It was wonderful how she was so invested in the science of her time and understanding the theories behind this volcano and what it was doing to the weather. But it was also, she was an imaginative young woman, and this was really coming into the imagery of her novel as well. Also, Shelley and Byron and Polidori are all debating about men creating life from death. They're talking about the electricity experiments in Newgate prison. And I love this moment for Mary, because you can just see her. She is known to have not partaken in this dialogue. She didn't debate with the men, but instead she goes upstairs and she describes having this wakeful dream, and she begins writing. And she, in her words, described having a wakeful dream where she really imagined the creature. I think it must have been such an amazing night, because the credit is given to Byron again for daring this young woman to write a ghost story. But they're staying in the Villa Diote where Milton wrote Paradise Lost, and they're surrounding themselves with literature and debating about life from death and these experiments, and this all gels into this story. So there's so much more beyond than just daring to write a ghost story. She's writing this social commentary of her day about the wars that have ravished the country, and the cruelty of man, and the cruelty of man thinking that they can interfere with God and create life from death. And, you know, all these thoughts are swirling together as she conceives her creature. So she begins writing, but she's not in the she's not at the end of her tragedy. She has been feeling incredibly guilty for having abandoned her sister Fanny, who commits suicide, and her father won't even let Mary claim her body to put her in a grave. He casts Fanny off into an unmarked grave. And I think this is really a key moment also in the book, because the whole concept of Dr. Frankenstein creating this creature and then rejecting it. Mary is feeling so rejected by her father. And then this is just the final nail in the coffin in terms of his rejection towards her sister Fanny. Mary's own mother tried to commit suicide when she found out she was pregnant with Fanny. And that really was a fact that her father, Godwin, shared with the girls when they were very young. And so they were completely burdened with the fact that their lives were considered a burden to her mother, considered a burden to her father. She's feeling completely rejected by Godwin. And this is a kind of another theme about when Shelley and Byron are debating about man creating life. You know, I think this is a reaction to that, of what she has witnessed in terms of fathers abandoning their children. And so this is where I wanted this to be a biography of her, but I wanted it to be something more, because I feel like it's always, you're taking a risk when you're writing about a character and putting words in their mouth. But after 6 years of diving into her life, I just felt like the creature and her were so connected, that this, for a teenage woman to be able to write this book and the incredible loss and hardship she endured, and for her to be able to survive all of that and create this creature, I know in my own experience in writing, you become so completely involved in the work. And so I dared to write this poem where I'm giving the creature and her this back and forth commentary. So it says, do you hear me? I keep writing until my pen scratches pain as loud as screams, but it's no longer my own voice I hear. It is the creature's. Ink black words on paper are no longer words. They breathe and pulse with a life of their own. They are heart and legs and arms and hands made of flesh and bone. And they reach down my throat and into my lungs and grab my breath and squeeze out my tears until they become the creature's own. His voice calls out to me, now, Mary, you begin to see. And then he says, I am an exiled girl who feels so rejected by her father, she must create a family from ghosts. I am a poet who feels persecuted because society loathes him for his beliefs. I am a sister shackled by illegitimacy and despair, lying down to die alone. I am an abandoned wife standing beside a river, no longer able to endure living. I am the rage and shame that burn like embers through you. I am the words torn from your mind until they pulse like a beating heart. I am your creature. My creature is me. So that takes us to the end. There's a brief part of the book where I followed through with the story because Shelley ultimately dies soon after, and just showing the young readers what happened to this remarkable woman. For those of you teaching this text, on my website there is an in-depth timeline describing both my writing process and the development of this book, because it took 6 years. And I also share a lot of the part where I write visually for those of you who are teaching youngsters who are like me, who engage with text differently. For me, when I've learned as an adult, when I'm reading text, to give myself the space to visually see the text, and that way I engage with the reading in a very different way. And though I'm still dyslexic, it has helped me engage in text in a way that's very different than when I was a youngster. So I'm going to go back to, let's see, how do I go back to not sharing the screen? Do we, Dave? I'm going to try to go back to,
I think at
I
the
don't see
top,
stop share.
Yeah,
Pause share?
can stop share the top.
Here, okay, there. I think we're all back together, right? Great. So I don't know if we have time for questions, if any of you have questions or.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have time for questions. And first of all, thank you, Lita, so much for such a beautiful presentation, and for, just the beautiful book in general. It's been such a pleasure to read it. And I also look forward to using it more often in my own courses. And hopefully so many of us here on this call will opt to do the same too. So we do have some time for questions, depending on how many people want to ask a question. I may ask everyone to raise their hands, but we can just start with ad hoc at this point. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Lita?
I was hoping, Leah, could you speak for a moment about the text and the typography and that kind of what's going on there?
So one of the challenges with the typography was to make it very clear when Mary's speaking versus when her creature is speaking. And one of the challenges with the book was that the creature opens the book, and then Mary starts telling her story, and then we don't see the creature again until very late in the book, because we don't see the creature until the creature has been created. And so I needed to problem solve how to make that clear. And then the added complication of, one of the remarkable things about Mary was that she wrote this book in basically 9 months. She conceived a child right about the time she started writing the book, and she gave birth to a child just a couple of weeks from finishing the book. And she spoke of the creature as her own progeny. And so I wanted to honor that into the structure of the book. And so the book is divided into 9 chapters. for the 9 months of conception. And each chapter is started with a quote from her mother. So there's 3 different voices speaking in the book. And again, visually, for me, whenever there's a solution that has to be achieved through writing, visually is always the answer always comes to me visually. And so I wanted to create a font that kind of reads like the creatures, and then a separate font for Mary, so that hopefully young readers, particularly when you are dyslexic, things like font changes can be very complicated and kind of scramble your thoughts. But I feel like if you do it in a way that's sensitive to visual readers, you can actually make it be a beautiful element to the book, as opposed to something that's adding complications to them.
Thank you. I think I have a list in order of everyone who has raised hand or asked so far. Catherine, Bryonie, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much for this, Lita. This was fabulous. You know, I'm really excited to go back to the text again. I enjoyed it on the first read, but this has like enriched it even more for me. I was actually really moved by your description of your highly visual planning process and thinking process. Like I'm not dyslexic, but I do identify as neurodivergent, and I find that I'm extremely visual in my thinking and planning process too. And I wondered if you would mind elaborating a little bit on the kind of advice you give educators on how you can incorporate like visuality into the writing process, because I feel like that's something I would have really benefited from when I was learning, and even now as a PhD student working on my dissertation, it's a mode of thought that I kind of find myself resorting to, but it's hard to communicate to, say, like advisors and other people. So I would love to hear you elaborate a little bit on that.
Oh, I so appreciate your question, Catherine, because this is, I feel like this is something that if we talked about this more, it would have changed my life as a youngster. And I think it would change a lot of lives as youngsters. It took me so long to acknowledge. I mean, I dreamed of being a writer when I was a youngster, and I did very well at school. I graduated valedictorian, both high school and college. You know, I was bright, but English class was such a struggle for me because writing the way I was taught to write was just it was a mountain that seemed unclimbable, and it took all the joy out of it for me. And it also, I had the wrong idea of what it was to be a writer, because I remember when I was, when I wrote my first book, it was a nonfiction book about my grandparents, and I had discovered foot tracings. They had done a relief effort after World War II, and there was the artifacts in their attic of foot tracings of people from Germany who had sent tracings of their feet on newsprint so that they could send them the right size shoes. Anyways, it's a long story, backstory behind that book, but it was a visual prompt that allowed me, it was the entranceway into writing, because that visual image of these thousands of foot tracings on ancient newspaper that I had found in their attic was such a visual prompt for me that it allowed me to just start writing. But my first several books, I drew pictures before I could find the words, and I would actually post the pictures to a bulletin board, and I would struggle, and my husband would look at what I was doing. You know, I came from a science background. I was a geologist. I worked on dinosaur digs. I really didn't know I was going to be a writer, but I was just experimenting, playing around with this. And I would say, you know, I wish I can't find the words. And my husband said, the story's there. Tell me what's happening. And I would just say, well, this and this and this. And he's like, well, there's your words. And I realized drawing was writing for me. And it took me so long to give myself permission for that. And I think around the 20th book, I thought I'm going to graduate and just write a book. And it was a miserable experience. Nothing worked. I went back to drawing, and it suddenly occurred to me, this is my process. This is how I write. It is writing. I just do it with words, and then our pictures, and those pictures find the words. I wish so much that we would teach writing that way for those of us who create that way, because I think a vast number of kids who struggle with that blank page we always talk about, oh, the blank page is intimidating. I don't think the blank page is intimidating. I think it's the fact that for some of us, we find the pictures to our stories long before we find the words. So it's like we're forced to work backwards. And that doesn't make any sense, that writing has to be taught that way. So I wish we would create more of a dialogue around how storytelling, ultimately the results of storytelling is very visual. People will talk about their novel and say it's a very visual novel, but we don't talk about how writing is a visual process. So we acknowledge that the results are visual. So if we could acknowledge that for many of us, the process is visual, I think it would really unlock the keys to writing for a lot of us.
Thank you so much, Lita. That was fabulous. And it's cool to hear someone from a STEM background talk about this kind of cognitive process, because I associate it so much with like the arts, quote unquote. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Adam?
Hi, Lita. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed seeing those visuals and seeing the poetry. And even if I don't win this at the end, I'm definitely going to go buy it. I have written a verse biography of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I finished it a couple of years ago. Yeah, so I mean, this is the first thing I've seen where I'm like, hey, I did that, and well, really, I've been trying to get it published, and I find that the hybrid nature of what I've done, it makes it difficult. So, academic presses say we don't publish poetry, and then certain poetry presses will say we don't think we can market this. So I was wondering if you could talk about, when you think about how to market the book, because I feel like you probably have a lot more experience than me. Did you originally conceive of it, say, like for YA audiences, or how did you think about like who was going to read the book and how you were going to get it out there? I would love anything that you could tell me about that.
Yeah. YA from the start for me, which is ironic because I swear I'd never write for YA, but just because I was so happy in the world of picture book. But she was a pregnant teenage runaway. It had to be YA. And I've spoken to adult audiences say, why did you write this for YA? And it's like, why wouldn't I write this for YA? It absolutely had to be a YA novel. I wish I could say words of encouragement for, I think a visual novel to Coleridge would just be so incredible. I wish I could say finding a publisher, this blew the gates open for this genre. It was a very hard and frustrating project to bring into fruition. And I benefited only by the fact that I had a bit of a track record with my books. So my publisher was willing to take a risk on me. Even at that point, though, we could spend an hour speaking about all the pitfalls of this story. It's prohibitively expensive to have this much visual content. The paper has to be thicker. The ink was bleeding through. It's so expensive that the publishers were, really trying to fight against that. And also they knew that bookstores want to catalog this as a graphic novel or as a nonfiction biography. This was breaking genres in so many different ways. And I took a huge pay cut to write this book because ironically, I could write 12 picture books in the time it took me to write this book, and I got paid a quarter of what I get paid for a picture book. This project was a passion project. And a lot of people ask me, why don't you do more? And to be honest, I can't afford to do more. The reality is, my income as a writer is our sole income. So that part is discouraging. I will say that people have really reached out and loved the book. So it's frustration to me that publishers don't recognize that. But publishing is it's a business at the end of the day too. And whenever you have a business, I know this as an entrepreneur, you have to have a product and it has to have a label and it has to fit, in a defined area. So if you can afford to do this as a passion project, I do think there are publishers who are willing to take a chance on these projects. But I think we as creators have to make a lot of sacrifices to make these projects happen too. I wish I wish I had a different answer for you in terms of the reality of it, but that is the reality of publishing right now.
Oh, that's okay. Thanks a lot. And yeah, I've heard that a couple of times. So thank you.
All right. And just to kind of keep with the theme of visuals, Amy, you had a question about visual motifs. Oh, here it is. It's in the chat. She just texted or sent it to me in the chat. I've been really geeking out about the visual motifs in this book, like the creature's hands and eyes, which characterize him beautifully. How are you thinking about visual as well as thematic through lines in your project?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I'm writing a book, and when I say writing, it's drawing and writing. I'm always thinking about how I can create through lines, thematic through lines particularly because I come from a background of writing for really young kids. And I get, I have the good fortune of being one of the creators who gets to turn kids onto literacy, which to me is terribly exciting because literacy has played such a vital role in my life. And my life is so different because I eventually had the access to the books and to the people who allowed me to engage with books in a way that was right for me. And that really, really changed my life. And one of the things I find is repetition of theme, particularly for young readers, really helps them understand the story. In Mary, it felt so appropriate because there's such a repetition between the parallels between the creatures, her novel and her life. And because it's written in poetry, the text is very spare. It has to cover so much ground because there's the historical backstory. There's her sister dies. Shelley's wife commits suicide. They lose 4 out of 5 babies. I mean, there's so many deaths. There's so many things that happen that have to be handled in a way that's very sensitive to young readers. But there's so much that you can create into the art that creates that theme. So there's a lot of places where you can draw isolation or draw that heavy loss in a way where you don't want the art to look exactly the same. You want it to have variety, but you start seeing these themes, and that solidifies in the content so that kids can understand when they've read Frankenstein and they see these themes of isolation and of cruelty, of being rejected by the father, Dr. Frankenstein. You see that same visual theme in Mary's own life, and I think that helps kids understand the content in a way. I think one of the things I really respect young readers, because when I'm creating a book for young readers and I put something into the art, something even very subtle, I've just been with so many young readers who will catch it. And ironically, a lot of times parents don't catch the visual theme, but the kids will see it because they're so attuned to detail. And so it's very exciting for me to create for young children, because I think before we are literate, we are so visual. And then over time, some of us keep that and some of us lose it because we join the world of literacy. And it's a shame that we have to, some of us have one or the other, or, as we gain one skill, it's sort of, I have a friend who is blind, and her sense of hearing and her sense of touch is so different than the rest of us. So anyways, I'm trying to create a really rich tapestry of these themes reoccurring through the art to try to solidify that content for readers. And because I have the joy of creating for young readers, I feel like a lot of that is seen by my readers.
Thank you. And we have just 2 or 3 minutes left, but I wanted to kind of combine 2 questions here from both Melissa and Hadley. Can you elaborate on the artistic decision you made with respect to how you included some of the male voices in your text? Because obviously the emphasis is on Mary, but Hadley and Melissa are also wondering, to what extent do Shelley or Byron or even Victor Frankenstein himself come into the text, and what was your artistic decision surrounding that?
Yeah, I did struggle with Byron a lot. Really, he's just such a was so hard on Mary. Shelley was an amazing man. He was such a troubled soul, and he, you know, was quite abusive towards her because he was so lost in his own mental instability. But he did love her extremely, and I hope I conveyed that through the text. And it was such a remarkable thing to see his ideals and his dreams. Unfortunately, he was just so troubled. So he was such an interesting person to write because he was kind of all over the map, you know. And one of my favorite poems, I can't remember the title of it. If you have the book, though, it's when they're setting across France, and it was my favorite poem because I would read about how Shelley, he sprains his ankle, right? They set out, they have hardly any money, trunks full of books. Shelley's packed all these books. He sprains his ankle. They buy a mule with what little money they have. He rides it, and his pregnant girlfriend and her sister, both teenagers, are lugging these books across the country, and he's reciting Wordsworth poems on the mule, saying everything is a dream and it's great. I mean, so he was so fun to create his voice because it was just like so out there. It was remarkable and wonderful, and also just haunting and searingly painful. Byron, the only way I could write Byron, I remember I was riding my bike and I had been struggling with those passages. And then I realized it was okay to be angry with him. I usually love my characters, but it was actually okay to be pissed off at Byron because he was a remarkable man too, but he was very hard on Claire and Mary. And, you know, Claire became pregnant by Byron and he took her child away from her. And it was okay for me to just realize that in the moments of this book, we see him at his worst. And so it was interesting to kind of set Mary off against that energy and realize what a remarkable person she was to survive that. The other male voice that I think really comes into play with this book is her father, Godwin, because he sets her up with his ideology that she was born out of wedlock and that women or marriage is just a contract and people should be allowed to be free. And then he's a complete hypocrite and casts her off, even though he, you know, birthed her out of wedlock. She turns around, gets pregnant, and he casts her off. So his voice was a really key part in writing and understanding who she formed. So even though this book is written from her perspective, those three men played such a vital role in creating our understanding of what, you know, they're kind of the counterbalance to what she was coming up against constantly in her life.
Thank you for that. And that's such a fascinating answer. And I look forward to revisiting the text with that in mind. We have one final question from Neil, and it's, I wonder if Lita knows Goya's Disasters of War. If so, did it influence her?
I'm sorry, I missed that. The computer flaked out.
I wonder if Lita knows Disasters of War. If so, did it influence her?
Oh, no, I don't know that. No. Can you, I'd love to read it or.
Yeah. Neil, would you like to
Neil.
elaborate by any chance?
It's a series of plates that Goya does based on the disasters of the French Revolution as he sees it playing out through the Spanish countryside. And its visual style reminds me in some ways of Lita's visual style, which is what made me wonder if she had seen Goya and thought about Goya when she did this.
I love this question. I did not think about Goya. Of course, I have seen his work. Thank you for showing the imagery. You know, the person who actually really influenced my art in that section of the book was Kathleen Hoffman, who was, was she German or Finnish? I'm sorry, Kathy Kollwitz. Sorry, I got too many. Kathy Kollwitz, who was a woman who depicted just the tragedy of loss and war. And what I think was remarkable about her was that we don't see many images of war created by women. And when women create the disasters of war, it's different because it focuses a lot on the loss, you know, of the children left behind, and the horrible distortion and devastation. So she was a huge influence for me in creating that work, because when I was reading Mary's diary of that period of time, she was so horrified by, you know, children who were deformed by malnutrition, and it harkened back to the imagery that I had remembered Kathy Colwitz creating.
Thank you so much. So many wonderful layers here, and I've really enjoyed the questions and hearing your answers. I'm going to turn things back over to Kate as we close out the raffle and the meeting in general. Thank you again, Lita. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lita, so much for a wonderful talk and just amazing visuals. I have the results of our raffle. So Matt Park and Dennis Manning, you will be receiving a copy of Lita's book. And we're very excited to give both of you this book, especially Matt was part of our current symposium in October as part of Bard's Micro College, and really has helped us connect us to high school audiences. So it seems very fitting that you would have won this thanks to the random generator of the website. I hope the rest of you will buy the book and use it. And more than that, join us for other events in the future. I think our next event will be our current symposium at the end of October in 2024. So please stay tuned for that. There will also be a public arts project that you might want your students to take part in if you're teaching or doing anything with Byron in the fall. But really another round of applause for Rita, and thank you so much all for being here. It's wonderful to be in community with you. And if you have any suggestions or comments, always feel free to email me or the other board members. And everybody have a good rest of your day, wherever you are.
Thank you, everybody.